Um, Mr. Epstein, recently I toured a company called Radiant, met with the CEO, Doug Bernauer, who is an amazing individual, who was challenged by Elon Musk to help to colonize Mars, and came to the conclusion the only way to provide electricity and get electricity to Mars was through micronuclear. I also met Isaiah Taylor with Valar Atomics, which is an amazing, very creative company that's using carbon sequestration in their process to combine it with other, like with the oxygen or hydrogen, in order to create jet fuel, which is just mind-blowing. You get electricity and the byproduct is jet fuel.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Okay, so as you can see, we're still covering that same committee hearing. I'm really fascinated by all this stuff. This is a very interesting conversation you're about to witness right here. So make sure and buckle up for that. Smash that like button for me, subscribe if you're new around here, and share this video anywhere and everywhere you can. That would be lovely if you guys could also click that join button. You know I want you to do it, and you know you want to do it. Just think about it, and let's get into it.
With that being said, can you speak to how the regulatory process for these guys who are doing very creative, very innovative stuff might be stifling to that mindset?
Yeah, I admire these guys for trying, because it's so difficult to do things. I mean, for all the reasons I mentioned, the licensing process, it could be difficult to test things. The whole linear no threshold in ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. So all these dogmas, as I said, can be changed, and it'll just radically open the frontier for innovation, where companies like these can go very quickly from idea to action. Right now, there's just an enormous gap between idea to action. One other thing that needs to change, I think, is the cultural discussion of nuclear. We heard from Ranking Member Frost and I think some others that like 3 Mile Island was the problem. But as Scott Perry pointed out, like 3 Mile Island is not fundamentally a problem. Like the fact that the worst nuclear accident we've had is something that killed nobody, that should be celebrating nuclear. So we need to stop demonizing nuclear like The Simpsons did. We need to recognize it's fundamentally safe. It's not safe primarily because of regulation. It's safe because the material cannot explode like combustion can.
Thank you. One last question, Mr. Smith. When I speak to them, they refer to the 18-month period. Can you describe the dynamic of getting the permitting process done, and why companies that are ready to go today are having to go through an 18-month period?
Which 18-month period?
For review.
So I think there's a lot of opportunities to reduce review times. One example is actually the mandatory hearings that Alex mentioned in his testimony as well. So those kinds of reviews don't involve input from the public, and they already cut times from 6 months to 3 months by moving from in-person oral hearings to written testimony and submissions. And there's a lot of opportunities to cut those down and see the kinds of things like Governor Cox wants to see in Utah of, we can build something by July 4th, 2026. We can have test reactors that we don't push companies to the Philippines or outside of the US to test and experiment what used to be and started as an American technology.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to interject right quick. There's a little bit more to that segment, but just right quick, like, okay, so the deregulation, especially around nuclear, and right now, it's definitely needed. There are so many regulatory burdens on any sort of nuclear power plant that needs to be built or whatever. There's just so much around that could be released. We could release those shackles, the regulatory shackles off, and actually build power plants at a much faster rate. And I think that needs to be done. But let's keep going, because we got a Democrat coming in, y'all.
Recognize Ranking Member Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, there's a few things. I mean, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle was talking a lot about picking winners and losers with some of the subsidies we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act. And, I've never heard him speak about the tons of subsidies that for, over a century we've given to fossil fuels as a country. And, I agree with Representative Min as well. I mean, the biggest winner from the big ugly law ripping away a lot of these investments we've made in American companies as it relates to clean energy is China, when we talk about that entire market. The other thing, too, that I think is really important to keep in mind is we are not. I mean, I heard this from one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle too. You know, we're not here trying to demonize nuclear companies. None of us are here saying the nuclear companies want to hurt anyone or anything like that. But there is a balance here between the safety of our people and also moving quickly on this. It is our job to recognize and keep in mind. And it worries me when people saying, well, it's 100%, there's nothing wrong with this and that, kind of like what we just heard from Mr. Epstein, that creates this environment where we're more open to big issues, which again can set us back decades as it relates to nuclear. But Mr. Burns, when we heard Mr. Epstein say that, nuclear can't explode like combustion can, you made a face. I just wonder if you have a response to that. And just generally curious when it comes to human health and safety, why are the careful, comprehensive regulations and inspections still necessary?
Well, I think my reaction is that I acknowledge 3 Mile Island, because of design and other facilities we didn't lose the containment. There was some concern over it at the time in terms of some of the assessment. But what we did, I think what we learned from 3 Mile Island, it's not so much whether someone had died or not. It says, but how do we think about preventing that in the future? We don't want to go down that path. And yeah, for example, I agree with Chernobyl, a reactor design that would never have been licensed in the United States. But again, it's about learning and a learning culture in terms of what's the significance of that. There was, for example, no emergency preparedness programs prior to the 3 Mile Island accident. That has went into effect. Other ways in terms of operator, particularly operator competence and things like that, came into being. And so those are the things you learn, and you learn them not just from the big accidents, but other things that have happened over the years. We learned in terms of looking at security measures after the 9/11 attacks, which actually had a benefit in terms of what we saw as we evaluated the Fukushima Daiichi accident and things like that. So it is this, if you want to call it a learning culture, but partly is assessing where you've been and what that may mean. And yeah, it also includes saying, where am I misfocusing, or where do I need to improve my focus? If I could, and respond to that question with respect to the mandatory hearing, I and a number of former commissioners have joined, we've sent a letter in supporting basically the elimination of the mandatory hearing. But what I want to emphasize is that is not NRC's fault. That mandatory hearing has been on the books in the Atomic Energy Act since the late 1950s, and part of that was due to a lack of transparency by the Atomic Energy Commission. Thank you, Mr. Strauss. In terms of not providing the Congress or the general public information about the licensing of what was then the Fermi 1 reactor. So anyway, I support the elimination of the mandatory hearing.
Yeah, and possibly something to explore a lot further, bipartisan way. I yield back.
And that right there, folks, is part of the problem. A lot of Congress, they just don't do anything. They don't do their job. We pay these people $242,000 a year to go up to Washington, D.C., on your dime, by the way, and fundraise. Hey, let's raise some money for the DNC or the RNC or whatever it may be. Let's go have dinner with a lobbyist. That's the vast majority of their job, folks, so that they don't do things like, hey, let's go through all these regulations and see if some of this stuff is unnecessary, like the review process, like they were talking about. Like, that's, you hear review process and you think, oh, well, they'll come up with some sort of plan to do this and blueprints and all that other stuff, and they just review it. No, folks, That is like a 15-step process where you get your initial basic, what you want to do, the blueprints or whatever, and then they review that, and then that goes to another step. Then you got to refine that. It goes to another step, and then they review that. Then it goes to another step, and it's a 15-step process. Then it's got to go to this board, and they have to approve these plans, and then it's got to go over here to this board, and they have to review this, and then you got to come in for a hearing, and then they got to review that, and then this has got to be reviewed, and then this got to be changed. And it is frustrating to go through some of this stuff. Look, I'm not on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or anything like that, but look, I work in construction, and we have to deal with a lot of this stuff. I run jobs doing glass, like commercial glass, and just with that, there are so many regulations, like steps to get to before we can even start putting a simple window into a building. It is nuts, folks, some of the regulations. Now, some of it's necessary, but like having 4 or 5 different environmental impact statements, what is the point in that? The only point is, folks, is to slow down progress. This was one main reason why I was backing Vivek Ramaswamy in the 2024 presidential election before he dropped out. I wanted him because that was one of his main focuses, was to come in and just nuke, pun intended, nuke the regulatory shackles that this country has that is stifling this country. He was talking about, not being able to compete with China. Well, you know why that is? Regulations, folks. Now, once again, I'm not one of these libertarian types that thinks we could just deregulate everything and just, let's let the market dictate what goes on here, right? Like, sure, to some extent, I get it. People like their survivability, right? They don't want to go in and just start doing things that get a bunch of people killed, right? So I don't think that we should just remove all regulations. There are some regulations that make a lot of sense. Right, we do need to think about public safety when we're talking about nuclear power plants and things of this nature. Right, we do need to keep people safe, but there is an extent where you can be too safe, folks. Yeah, you might think that's a dumb statement, right? But it's not, because there's definitely overkill when it comes to safety, like getting into a scissor lift, which, if you don't know what that is, it's just basically an electric man lift. It's a platform that's about 2.5 foot wide, generally speaking, 2.5 foot wide, about 6 foot long, and it just goes straight up and down. It has this scaffolding that is crossed like this that goes up and down. Essentially, it's just a platform. There are many of these refineries that we have all around in this area of Southwest Louisiana that force you, essentially I said calls, I don't know why, but that force you to not only, you have to put on a safety harness while you're in this thing. Now, mind you, this basket that is on top of this scissor lift that you actually work out of has a handrail that goes all the way around it that has to come up to 42 inches, which is the ADA standard height of any handrail. It has to come up to a certain height. So basically, if you bump into it, you're not going to fall out of it. So it's there to keep you from falling. Now, these plants out here, they say, no, that's not good enough. So they make you put on this harness, right? And you would think, well, that's not that bad, right? Well, hang on just a second. That's not all they do. You got to put on this harness. All right, so now you have to go and get a lifeline and have this lifeline tied off somewhere above where you're going to be working, so that if the lift, for some freaking reason, an act of God comes along and tips this thing over, you won't fall to the ground. It's ridiculous. It might not sound ridiculous if you don't know what it is, but when you see it in action, and when I've worked out of these for hours and hours and hours at a time, you cannot fall out of these. These things do not just tip over. I'm sorry. Look, but that's just one example, a simple safety regulation that I think is ridiculous. There's another one in the plants that, a 4-foot ladder, you have to be tied off to something above you when you're working anything above 2 feet. 2 feet. That is ridiculous, folks. And it's regulations like this just make these things so absurd. And especially when it comes to nuclear power plants. There's so many regulations that are just an absurdity, folks. And I don't know them all, or I would spout them all off. But, you know, I do know that there is a lot. Like all these environmental impact statements and all that garbage. Like we know what's going to happen here, right? We don't need that many environmental impact statements. It's all absurdity, and a lot of that needs to be done, and hopefully Trump will come in and review, have somebody review these regulations and deregulate. Let this country prosper once again. That is the bread and butter of this country. Deregulation. This country would boom like you would never have seen before, folks. But I think that's all I got on this one. I want y'all to let me know what y'all think about all this down in the comments section. And y'all try to have a good day. Y'all don't forget to smash that like button, by the way. I would really, really appreciate that. But y'all let me know what y'all think. Have a good day. Stay legitical. Peace.